بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So last week then we started into Sahih Al-Bukhari and we began with a short biography of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, and then we had just started going into a brief analysis of what this book Sahih Al-Bukhari actually is. The first thing we had mentioned was that the name of the book isn't actually just Sahih Al-Bukhari. The full name of the book, as mentioned by Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar and Al-Imam Al-Nawawi and others, is Al-Jami' Al-Sahih Al-Musnad من حديث رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وسننه وأيامه. That is the title that Ibn Hajar mentioned is the full and actual title of Sahih Al-Bukhari. Then we had mentioned the reasons behind this book being compiled in the first place by Al-Imam Al-Bukhari. And there were three reasons mentioned as to why Al-Imam Al-Bukhari put together Sahih Al-Bukhari. What was the first reason? That was the second, that's the easy one to remember. What was the first one we mentioned last time? So at his time, there were other books available. At his time now, the scholars were writing books. And there were other books of hadith available at that time, but they were all a kind of mixture. There would be authentic narrations in them, there would be Hasan narrations in them, there would even be weak narrations in them. So he wanted to compile one that was purely authentic narrations. That was one reason. So it was basically a lack of anything equivalent to this out there at the time. The second reason regarding his teacher was so there was the Ibn Hajar mentioned his teacher who was Ishaq ibn Rahoya, and some of them pronounce it as Rahaway. And the reason why some scholars don't like to pronounce it as Rahaway as opposed to Rahoya, why? Because the way it's written, it can be pronounced as Rahaway. But some scholars don't like to pronounce it as Rahaway. They say Rahoya. They mention something about how way, that sound, that name like that, has some connotation or connection to the shaitan or something. And so they say to pronounce it in that way is not suitable. And so some scholars, they mention it should be said as Rahoya. And other scholars too who end with that same way, with the same ending, they say it's preferred to avoid the way sound. So Ishaq ibn Rahoya, he had mentioned to his students, Al-Imam Al-Bukhari being one of them, that if only one of you would put together a book with the authentic narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Al-Imam Al-Bukhari said, those words of my teacher, they fell into my heart and I took it upon myself to do that. And the third reason mentioned was the dream, where Al-Imam Al-Bukhari had a dream. He saw himself doing what? Standing in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and pushing away anything coming towards him with a fan. And so when Imam Al-Bukhari asked some of those who have some understanding of the affairs of dreams, they told him that this is an indication of you defending the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from all falsehood. And so Imam Al-Bukhari, he took it upon himself to do exactly that, to defend the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from all falsehood by compiling a book with purely authentic narrations within it. And it's mentioned, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, he mentioned Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, every time he decided on a hadith to put it into the book, to include it in the book, every hadith he included after analyzing it and determining it's authentic, he would pray 2 raka'at. He would pray 2 raka'at every time before, like istikhara, 2 raka'at istikhara upon every single hadith he put into Sahih Al-Bukhari. So then, moving on from that now to the rest of the analysis before we go into the first hadith, what is the actual content of Sahih Al-Bukhari? Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala says, تقرر أنه التزم الصحة. What is well known and established is that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari stuck to a condition of making sure that every narration is Sahih. That was a condition. Whereas some of the other scholars, you might say, why are we saying that? Surely every scholar, when they wrote books of hadith, had a condition of making them all Sahih. No, not necessarily. Some of the scholars, they put together books of hadith and they included narrations that are lower than Sahih. They included on purpose, knowing certain narrations are Hasan, and some of the scholars of hadith even included da'if narrations, knowing they are da'if. And there were reasons behind that. Some of them it was to show the reason why some of the fuqaha came to the position that they came to. So it's like a scholar putting together a book, Tahara, Salah, Zakah, Sawm, Hajj, etc. And under each book, including the various hadith in Tahara, Salah, Zakah, etc., the Sahih, the Hasan, and then including some that are known to be da'if, but for the purpose of allowing the people to understand that this is the narration the fuqaha of XYZ used to say that you have to do this or you have to do that. This was the reason they took their position. So sometimes it was simply to clarify the reasonings as to why the fuqaha came to certain opinions and positions, so they would insert those narrations. But here, Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, what is known about him, his objective wasn't any of those kind of things. His objective was purely authenticity. وَأَنَّهُ لَا يُورِدُ فِيهِ إِلَّا حَدِيثًا صَحِيحًا. And that he would not put in there any hadith unless it was sahih. هَذَا أَصْلُ مَوْضُوعِهِ. That is the core of the content. The Sahih Hadith. وهو مستفاد من تسميته إياه الجامع الصحيح. And we can see that and understand that from the very title of the book. The actual title that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari gave it, Al-Jami' As-Sahih. That book that compiles the Sahih. Not just generally the Sunan, for example. Sunan There are books known as the Sunan of such and such and so and so. They may have other types of narrations in there too. They are the general Sunan. But here this was intended as authentic only. Al-Jami' As-Sahih. ومما نقلناه عنه من رواية الأئمة عنه صريحا ثم رأى أن لا يخليه من الفوائد الفقهية والنكت الحكمية فاستخرج بفهمه من المتون معاني كثيرة فرقها في أبواب الكتاب بحسب تناسبها. So then Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar says, on top of just having authentic hadith in there, Al-Imam Al-Bukhari also included fiqh benefits and like benefits on certain rulings within the religion. He included those benefits and extracted meanings from those hadith and then spread those out across the different chapters of the book in terms of whatever was relevant under those chapter headings. So there is fiqh of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari in Sahih Al-Bukhari. And that is done, as we briefly mentioned last time, through the chapter headings. Because Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, he doesn't include hadith and then give explanations of them. There's no sharh mentioned in there. Sahih Al-Bukhari is just the hadith. But then where do we get the fiqh and these extra fawaid and benefits and rulings from? The titles Al-Imam Al-Bukhari made for the various chapters. By examining those titles and then examining the hadith under those titles, you suddenly start to realize some of the fiqh of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari. That's why they say sometimes you see a title saying XYZ and then you see a hadith that apparently has no connection to the title is mentioned. But when you analyze and examine, suddenly you see some very fine and precise benefit in that hadith that is mentioned in that title. So that is what they call the fiqh of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari. واعتنى فيه بآيات الأحكام فانتزع منها الدلالات البديعة وسلك في الإشارة إلى تفسيرها السبل الوسيعة. Also, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar mentions how Al-Imam Al-Bukhari included ayat from the Quran that indicate certain rulings, and then he derived evidences, wonderful points of evidence from that. So these kinds of affairs are noted in the chapter headings, and that is what they call the fiqh of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari. Al-Imam Al-Nawawi said, ليس مقصود البخاري الاقتصار على الأحاديث فقط. Al-Imam Al-Nawawi said, it was not the point or the objective of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari to mention just the hadith and just leave it at that. بل مراده الاستنباط منها. Rather, his intent was to derive meanings and rulings from them. It wasn't just a case of a list of authentic hadith. Here you go, a list of authentic hadith and that's it, nothing more to it. Rather, there was more to it. He precisely and carefully organized all of the chapters and where he put the hadith and which sections he put what and where. All of that precisely done to indicate meanings and fiqh and rulings. So Al-Imam Al-Nawawi said his purpose, his objective wasn't just to give you a book with a list of authentic hadith and that's it, nothing more to it. Rather, it was organized and detailed to give you greater understanding of those hadith and the rulings and the fiqh to be taken from them. والاستدلال لأبواب أرادها And so he used those hadith very carefully under the chapter headings to indicate the meanings that he intended from them. Then, to briefly look at some of the titles and what he mentioned in there. قال أبو أحمد بن عدي عن عبد القدوس بن همام قال شهدت عدة مشايخ يقولون حول البخاري تراجم جامعه أي بيضها بين قبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ومنبره وكان يصلي لكل ترجمة ركعتين. He mentions what we briefly just touched upon earlier, how every time Al-Imam Al-Bukhari added something into Sahih Al-Bukhari, every time he would pray 2 raka'at istikhara before adding it. And he mentions that he was sitting in Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi between the grave of the Messenger and the mimbar of the Messenger, meaning at the location of the Rawdah, and that he would pray 2 raka'at istikhara for every item, every hadith that he inserted and included in the book. So now then, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar mentions a few more details about his chapter titles. Because you have to remember, like we said, Al-Imam Al-Bukhari didn't add any of his commentary in Sahih Al-Bukhari. He didn't add any commentary, didn't add any ta'liqat, any explanation or commentary. He listed the hadith, but the only thing he did was organize them under chapter titles that he wrote. That's his input into it. And that one input, his chapter titles, have so much behind them. So Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar says, وَلْنَذْكُرْ ضَابِطًا يَشْمَلُ عَلَى بَيَانِ أَنْوَاعِ التَّرَاجِمِ فِيهِ. He says, let us mention some criteria that includes the different types of these chapter titles and headings and what he included in there. وَهِيَ ظَاهِرَةٌ وَخَفِيَّةٌ. Some of them are very apparent and obvious. It mentions a title and the hadith obviously matches that, it's clear. But some of them are khafiyah, where the link does not instantly become obvious or apparent. أما الظاهرة فهي أن تكون ترجمة دالة بالمطابقة لما يورد في مضمونها، وقد تكون الترجمة بلفظ المترجم له أو بعضه أو بمعناه، وهذا في الغالب. وأما الخفية وهي التي لا تدرك مطابقتها لمضمون الباب إلا بالنظر الفاحص والتفكير الدقيق، هذا الموضع هو معظم ما يشكل من تراجم هذا الكتاب. ولهذا اشتهر من قول جمع من الفضلاء فقه البخاري في تراجمه. وأكثر ما يفعل البخاري ذلك إذا لم يجد حديثا على شرطه في الباب ظاهر المعنى في المقصد الذي ترجم به ويستنبط الفقه منه، وقد يفعل ذلك لغرض شحذ الأذهان، وكثيرا ما يفعل هذا حيث يذكر الحديث المفسر لذلك في موضع آخر متقدما ومتأخرا. So now, talking about how Al-Imam Al-Bukhari uses his hadith, where he puts them under what chapter headings. Sometimes the link is apparent and obvious, but sometimes it is khafi. It is something very fine and hidden and not obvious, where the title, the chapter, the hadith don't link in a very apparent and obvious way, unless إلا بالنظر الفاحص وَالتَّفْكِيرِ الدَّقِيقِ. Unless you really analyze that and really deeply think about it, then you understand what Imam Al-Bukhari is trying to do there. And that is why he says many of the virtuous, many of the people of virtue, they mentioned fiqh al-Bukhari fi tarajumih, that the fiqh of Imam Al-Bukhari is in those titles and the way he puts together those chapter headings. And sometimes it could be that an Imam Al-Bukhari wants to make a certain point, but he doesn't find a Sahih hadith explicit upon his condition of authenticity that explicitly mentions that point he wants to address. So then he may find another authentic hadith that highlights the issue he wants to bring up, but in a very fine and delicate kind of way, not in an obvious way, where you have to really think about the hadith to understand. That's why it means X, Y, Z. That's why it indicates this benefit because of this and that. Sometimes he may have done it for that reason, because there was no obvious hadith on that subject that matched his level of authenticity he needed. So he used the hadith that maybe primarily are used for something else. The hadith may primarily be used for a certain issue, but then he may use it for some very precise point that is not obvious. Like the first hadith, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. This hadith is primarily used to talk about the intention of a person, and that your actions are judged upon your intentions. That is the obvious and primary meaning of that hadith. But, just as an example, I'm saying this, he may, for example, use a hadith like that in a chapter that isn't talking about intention or anything like that. Something completely different. So you think, why is this hadith in this chapter? This hadith is about intention, about actions, about being rewarded upon your intentions. And yet here, this chapter has nothing to do with intention, where Imam Al-Bukhari has put that hadith. But it could be because he wants to highlight some very precise or fine point that is in the hadith, if you really think about it. Maybe something to do with hijrah, maybe something to do with some of those issues. And when you analyze, then you realize that hadith is an evidence for this point. So that's where the concealed fiqh, or the real knowledge is also mentioned. And some scholars, they even say that maybe some occasions Imam Al-Bukhari did that, where he put these kinds of hadith into chapters that don't obviously match, in order to sharpen people's intellects. That people have to really stop and think and really ponder and analyze, how come? Why is this hadith in this chapter? Where's the connection? He wanted to sharpen people's minds. He wanted to make them think and focus on those chapters and why those hadith are there. Then another point to mention is bayan taqti'uhu للحديث وفائدة إعادته. Imam Al-Bukhari, one of the things that he does sometimes is that he may, literally as we say, cut a hadith into parts. And then mention a part of it under a certain chapter, a part of it under some other chapter. He would sometimes break up those chains of narration, etc., and split those narrations and mention them independently in different chapters. Why is that? Ibn Hajar, he said, قال الحافظ أبو الفضل محمد بن طاهر المقدسي في جزء له سماه جواب المتعنت اعلم أن البخاري رحمه الله كان يذكر الحديث في كتابه في مواضع ويستدل به في كل باب بإسناد آخر ويستخرج منه بحسن استنباطه وغزارة فقهه معنى يقتضيه الباب الذي أخرجه فيه، وقلما يورد حديثا في موضعين بإسناد واحد ولفظ واحد، وإنما يورده من طريق أخرى لمعان نذكرها والله أعلم بمراده منها. ثم سرد 8 معان لا يتصل المقام لذكرها هنا. He mentions Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar quoting Al-Hafidh Abu al-Fadl al-Maqdisi in a small treatise he wrote, Jawab al-Muta'annit. He said, know that Al-Imam al-Bukhari, he would mention a hadith in his book in different chapters, in different places, the same hadith, in different places of the book, in different chapters. And in each chapter, when he mentioned the same hadith, the same text, he would use a different chain of narration to that hadith, which then, according to the muhaddithun, as we say, is a different hadith. It's classified as another hadith. It's another hadith. It has a different chain of narration. So he would use the hadith overall is the same overall. The hadith is the same hadith overall, but the chain of narration to it is different. And with the chain of narration to it being different, then there will be some slight differences in the wording. It's like now, you have the Prophet ﷺ teaching, and there were 10 companions with him at that time, and they all heard that hadith from him. So then those 10 companions went and narrated it to their 10 sets of students, and then those 10 sets of students to their students. So now you've got all these different chains of narration. Different chains of narration. Anas ibn Malik to his students, Abdullah ibn Abbas to his students, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud to his students, and all of those chains are going, and they're all ultimately coming back to that one hadith. But now all of these chains are different hadith. They're all classified as different narrations, and there may be slight variation maybe in the wording here and there. So he would use a different version in the different chapters. It is very rare that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari uses the same hadith with the same chain of narration in multiple places in the book. Very rare that you have the same hadith twice. Same hadith, same chain of narration, everything. Rather, if the same hadith is mentioned somewhere else, it is actually classified as a different hadith because the chain of it will be different, and maybe even the wording of it will be different. So that is what he used to do. And then he did that because in every chapter he would use the version of that hadith, maybe with a slightly different wording, that indicates the exact point he's making in that chapter. And in the other one, use another chain of narration of that hadith. Maybe there's an odd word that's different, but that indicates the point he wants to make in that chapter. So he would use the different narrations with the different chains, and it's very rare that he used the exact same hadith, chain of narration, matan, everything in multiple places. ثم قال أما تقطيعه للحديث في الأبواب تارة واقتصاره منه على بعضه أخرى فذلك لأنه إن كان المتن قصيرا أو مرتبطا بعضه ببعض وقد اشتمل على حكمين فصاعدا فإنه يعيده بحسب ذلك مراعيا مع ذلك عدم إخلائه من فائدة حديثية كأن يورده عن شيخ سوى الذي أخرجه عنه قبل ذلك، أو يورده في موضع موصولا وفي موضع معلقا، ويورده تارة تاما وتارة مقتصرا على طرفه الذي يحتاج إليه في ذلك الباب. فإن كان المتن مشتملا على جمل متعددة لا تعلق لإحداها بالأخرى فإنه يخرج كل جملة في باب مستقل فرارا من التطويل، وربما نشط فساقه بتمامه. Here he mentions that sometimes Al-Imam Al-Bukhari would mention a given hadith in a chapter, and maybe that given hadith has multiple parts in the text. Some hadith, sometimes they are made up of different parts and it's all one hadith, meaning different pieces of advice and different topics in that same hadith. Any random example just to break up the sentences, like it may say, من حسن إسلام المرء تركه ما لا يعنيه, or if you mention the one about أتبع السيئة بالحسنة تمحوها, and then it carries on and says وخالق الناس بخلق حسن. That part is an independent sentence from the first part. As an example, first part is talking about follow up a bad deed with a good deed, it will wipe it out. Then there's another part to the hadith, deal with the people, interact with the people with good manners. So that's another independent kind of part to the hadith. That's what it means about how Al-Imam Al-Bukhari sometimes, if a hadith has different content in it, he would maybe in one chapter he wants to talk about mannerisms. So he may in that section quote the part of the hadith that he requires there. In another part he might want to talk about sins and wiping them out, so he quotes the part that is required there, in order to avoid Al-Bukhari becoming too big. Sometimes a hadith might be like a page long. If he mentions the full hadith in every chapter, even though he's making different points in all the different chapters, the book would become long. So instead of doing that, he mentions the hadith in the different chapters with only the section that is needed in those sections, in those chapters. So that is something Al-Imam Al-Bukhari also does. One of the other reasons may be to highlight, to make a differentiation, to vary up his chains of narration. So, for example, he narrates a particular hadith from one of his sheikhs, but he also knows that hadith from another one of his sheikhs. So maybe in one chapter he mentions the hadith via the chain of narration of this particular sheikh, and in the other chapter he mentions the same hadith but via the other sheikh he has it from too, to give variation to the chains of narration, since both of those that he knows are Sahih. So then he mentions them both, one for this sheikh, one via that sheikh, to vary up those narrations and those chains in the different chapters as well. Occasionally it is noted that he may occasionally mention the full hadith in different chapters rather than picking out the section that's needed. Occasionally that happens, but often it will not be the full narration every time in different chapters. There will be sections. Then, now to understand what exactly was the level of strictness that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari used when picking the hadith that passed his criteria for Sahih. to include in his book. What was his criteria? قال الحافظ ابن طاهر اعلم أن البخاري ومسلم ومن ذكرنا بعدهم أهل السنن لم ينقل عن أحد منهم أنه قال شرطت أن أخرج في كتاب ما يكون على شرط الفلاني، وإنما يعرف ذلك من صبر كتبهم، يعلم ذلك من صبر كتبهم، فيعلم بذلك شرط كل رجل منهم. The scholars, they never explicitly wrote introductions saying that this is the criteria I used to determine if a hadith is sahih or not. And Imam Al-Bukhari never wrote anywhere, here's my list of criteria, this is what I look at to determine if a hadith is authentic or not, or if it matches the bar that I have set or not. And Imam Al-Bukhari didn't give us any notes like that, telling us his exact criteria. So how do we know what criteria he used? By examining the hadith, by examining them, examining the chains of narration. The muhaddithun, they discovered, it's obvious, he is clearly using the criteria of X, Y, Z, because every single one of these narrations matches it. So it becomes obvious when they examine them that this is the particular criteria X, Y, Z he is using, because it's apparent and evident in all of his narrations. So that's how they discover that. When they read Sunan Abi Dawood, and they go through Sunan Abi Dawood, or Sunan Al-Tirmidhi, Sunan Ibn Majah, Al-Nasa'i, they examine it all and they realize that Al-Imam Al-Nasa'i, Al-Imam Ibn Majah, whoever it may be, their condition is X, Y, Z. Because they've included this, they've included that, and so that is what their criteria is, along with statements of the Imams themselves indicating their criteria. So that's how we discover what the criteria of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari is. So then what is it? After examining his hadith and chains of narration, what have we concluded about his criteria? He said, فَأَعْلَمْ أَنَّ شَرْطَ الْبُخَارِ وَمُسْلِمٍ أن يخرج الحديث المتفق على ثقة نقلته إلى الصحابي المشهور من غير اختلاف بين الثقات الأثبات ويكون إسناده متصلا غير مقطوع. The obvious first part is that Bukhari and Muslim, they will include the hadith where it is agreed upon that the narrators are all thiqah. They are all of that high level of trustworthiness, integrity, memorization, thiqah. Where it is agreed that all of the narrators are thiqah, up to the companion. And the companion himself must be you never say that the companions are thiqah or anything like that. There's no need, that's almost insulting. Every companion is thiqah. Everyone, we don't even say it. And that's why you see some people who are not strong students, they do their PhDs and maybe masters and things like that, and then if you do a master's PhD, it gets published. If it's a decent one, they publish them, or you can publish them yourselves afterwards. Sometimes you see in some of them, and it would appear, must be, that they are not experts in the field of hadith. Maybe they are in usul al-fiqh or tafsir or something else. So in their masters, maybe even PhD, sometimes you see them mentioning a hadith, and then at the bottom they say this hadith, this is the chain of narration to it, and then they go through the narrators, and he was thiqah, he was acceptable, this one was acceptable, this one was thiqah, and they get to the companion, and they say, Fulan, whoever the companion is, radiyallahu anhu, thiqah. And then in the faculty of hadith, our teachers, they used to laugh, they used to say, what is this? How are you writing next to the companion, thiqah? next to the tabi'een and those who come after them, yes, you need to distinguish. Because from the tabi'een, there may be some who were not good in their memory, some who had shortcomings in that affair, other things. And then after the tabi'een, even more, and then even more. So for all of those in the chain of narration, you're going to highlight, he was thiqah, he was okay, he was reasonable, he had some issues, he was thiqah. But when you get to the companion, you don't give a ruling on the companions, because every companion by default, there is nothing other than him being thiqah. For you to give a ruling on him, it's as though you're saying maybe some companions don't have the ruling of thiqah. It's as though you're saying maybe some companions don't have the ruling of being thiqah. So I need to write next to this companion, he was thiqah. Wrong. They're all thiqah. So with the companions, there's no such thing as, let me go check, was he thiqah or not? The companions are all of that level. So, Al-Imam Al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, they only include the narrations of those that are thiqah all the way up to the companion without any difference over them being thiqah. They are agreed upon as thiqah. And then the chains of narration need to be connected. Obviously, that's one of the conditions for an authentic hadith, that the chain of narration is connected all the way. This one certainly narrated from that one. He certainly narrated from that one. All the way, connected one to the next. However, despite Al-Imam Al-Bukhari and Al-Imam Muslim both agreeing on that, both only reporting the hadith of narrators that were thiqah, there's a difference. إِلَّا أَنَّ مُسْلِمًا أخرج أحاديث أقوام ترك البخاري حديثهم لشبهة وقعت في نفسه. However, there are certain narrators who Al-Imam Muslim gave the green tick on and used them and used their hadith in Sahih Muslim, that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari couldn't give his tick on them. He had some doubts on certain ones. So there are some narrators that Al-Imam Al-Bukhari refused to use their chains of narration in Sahih Bukhari. Whereas Al-Imam Muslim examined them thiqah, used them in Sahih Muslim. That there is a difference like that which exists. Al-Imam Muslim, obviously, when he examined those narrators, for him, any doubts that there were, he was able to verify those doubts are baseless according to him. So then he used those narrators. Examples of them, Hammad ibn Salama, and Suhail ibn Abi Salih, and Dawood ibn Abi Hind, and Abu Zubayr al-Makki, wal-Ala ibn Abd al-Rahman, and others. One of the things as well, is it mentioned here? No. One of the things as well that Al-Imam Muslim and Al-Imam Al-Bukhari differ over, Al-Imam Muslim and Al-Bukhari, like we said, they accept the narrations of those who are thiqah, agreed upon their being thiqah. And the chain of narration must be connected. So now then, if there is, and we mentioned this briefly I think once before, if there is a narrator A, who narrates from B in this given chain of narration, narrator A from B, from C, from D, companion. So now A, B, C, D, and then E is the companion. A, B, C, D are all thiqah, all of them thiqah. And A, B, C, and D, A and B both overlapped in their lifetimes. Have to overlap in your lifetime. If they don't overlap in their lifetimes, then guaranteed you do not have a connected chain of narration. If A narrates from B, but B died before A was born, A could not possibly have narrated from B. So their lifetimes must have overlapped. So A's lifetime must have overlapped with B at a reasonable level, not just A was 1 year old when B died. then we know he didn't narrate from him either. So at a reasonable level, A's life overlapped with B, B's life must have overlapped with C, C with D, D with the companion. As long as that exists, there is that overlap, there is that existence of coexistence, and they're all thiqah, and A says he narrated from B, and they were alive at the same time, their lives do cross over, then according to Al-Imam Muslim, there is no reason to reject that. A is thiqah, reliable, trustworthy, not a liar at all. B is thiqah, trustworthy, reliable, not a liar at all, not a mistaken person at all. So if A says he narrated from B, then we can accept that. They are thiqah. They are thiqah. That's the whole point of sciences of hadith, etc. We look at them. If they are thiqah, we can accept their narrations. So, Al-Imam Muslim says, I can take that. A, thiqah, overlapped with B. He says he narrated from him. That's acceptable then. B says he narrated from C. Their lives overlapped. So be it. So he'll accept that. This is very brief, the way we're explaining it. Al-Imam Al-Bukhari, though, he says, okay, so we have the same chain, A, B, C, D, to the companion. The same chain of narration. All of them are thiqah. A to B overlapped. B to C overlapped. C to D overlapped. D to the companion overlapped. And Imam Al-Bukhari says, but wait, I need more than just their lives overlapping. With their lives overlapping, there is obviously the clear possibility that they did narrate from each other. He says, okay, yes, that's clear. They lived at the same time. They overlapped at a reasonable age where it's more than likely that A did narrate from B and B from C. But I want explicit proof that there was an overlap not just of their lives, but of their locations. He says, I want proof that their locations overlapped too. So A, let's go through just a general chain of narration. A to the B in that chain of narration. Let's say A was 30 years old when B died. So, very possible and very likely maybe A was attending the lessons of B when A was only 20 years old. Maybe he was with that shaykh for 10 years before he died. Very reasonable. So they overlap, they are thiqah, no problem. But Al-Bukhari says, I want proof that A, who was from Kufa in Iraq, and B, who was from Medina, this shaykh, I want proof that either the shaykh B went to Kufa at some stage in his life, before, or that A or B went to Medina at some stage of his life before A died. If that can be proven, there's somewhere in his biography something about him having gone to Medina when he was 20 years old, and that would have been at a time when that Shaykh B was still 10 years from the point of his death. Then okay, now we have a confirmation that their locations overlapped, making it an extra layer of verification. We don't need that layer of verification, because if A and B are both thiqah, and A says he narrated from B, then so be it. Their lives overlapped. A says, I met B and narrated from him. Okay, good. We can accept that. We can. That's an authentic narration. But Al-Bukhari says, I want it even stronger. Extra layer of verification. I want the proof that their locations indeed overlapped. He says, if I can't find any proof anywhere that B went to the location of A, or A to the location of B, or that they both met in Hajj, which was very common in those days, and they narrated from each other. If I can't find any evidence of their locations overlapping, then I'm just going to give it a pass for now. That's Al-Imam Al-Bukhari. That's why they say Al-Imam Al-Bukhari is the strongest level of verification. Even though that extra layer of verification isn't needed. It's not required. What Al-Imam Muslim said is more than enough. It's a Sahih hadith. But Al-Imam Al-Bukhari was going the extra level. So those are some of the differences between them. So Imam Al-Bukhari, you can see he was at the highest level of authenticity. That's why they say the highest level of authenticity of any hadith are the ones that you find in Bukhari and Muslim. Because then you've got both Imams agreeing upon that narration. And if you've got both Imams agreeing on a narration which is called Muttafaqun alayhi, that's the highest level of authentic hadith. They are both agreed upon it. They've both verified, analyzed, and they've both agreed, yep, absolutely this narration is hadith. Muttafaqun alayhi is the highest level. Then after that, the ones that are in Bukhari, because his verification was even higher than Muslim. Then after that, the ones that are in Muslim. And then just to briefly mention, there are, of course, many explanations that have been written of Al-Imam Al-Bukhari's book. And incidentally, Ibn Hajar mentioned that when Ibn Hajar did his explanation of Sahih Al-Bukhari, how many years did it take Ibn Hajar to do his explanation of Sahih Al-Bukhari? 16 years? Huh? How many years did it take him to do it? In fact, what we should say is, leave the years aside, in fact. Leave the years aside. How many times did Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar read Sahih Al-Bukhari beginning to end in writing his explanation? They say, you've seen Sahih Al-Bukhari. Thousands of narrations in there. How many times did Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar go through it? This is Fath al-Bari, this is the first volume. And Fath al-Bari, this copy of it, it goes to about here. Maybe about there. So he wrote all of that. That would be thousands of pages. How many times did he read Al-Bukhari, the actual text of Al-Bukhari? You've seen the Dar es-Salaam English version, 8-9 volumes or something. All of that hadith by hadith by hadith by hadith. 13 times. And he said, every time I read it through again, I found extra benefits I added into the explanation. Then, when I read it the third time, I found extra benefits to add into the explanation. The fourth time, extra benefits. Fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th. Up to the 13th time he said, I noticed some extra benefits. 13 times it's mentioned he read through Al-Bukhari. And every time he said he found new benefits. After the 13th time, so the first 12 times, every time he found something new. On the 13th time, he didn't find anything new, and that's where he stopped then the explanation. It's mentioned on the 13th time he read it, he didn't find anything particularly new, and that was then the end of the explanation. So now when we think about studying books, a person goes through 3 principles, sits in 10 lessons, goes through the whole thing, and that's it, I finished 3 fundamental principles. He went through Al-Bukhari 13 times. That's how knowledge is. That is how it becomes grounded. So there are many other explanations. This is obviously the famous one, as some of the scholars said, La hijrata ba'd al-fath. There is no hijrah to be made after the fath. That's talking about the hadith regarding Mecca. After Mecca became the land of the Muslims, then that's it. There's no more hijrah to be made out of Mecca once they conquered it. And some of the scholars used to use that wording, La hijrata ba'd al-fath. That you don't need to go anywhere else after the explanation of Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar. That's it. Don't need to make hijrah to any other explanation. It's enough. Meaning how detailed it is, how much benefit there is. Of course, there are still many other explanations and other points of benefit, but to highlight the level of it, they used to use that example. No need to make hijrah after the Fath, meaning Fathul Bari, the explanation of Sahih Al-Bukhari of Ibn Hajar. There's many others that are written by the scholars. There's Fath al-Bari, again, another one known as Fath al-Bari by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, also known as Fath al-Bari, explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari. There's Fayd al-Bari also. There's so many. There's a whole list of them here, but we'll suffice with that for now. There are even books written on Sahih al-Bukhari, not on the texts, but on the chains of narration. Books written on the chains of narration that Al-Imam al-Bukhari used, the men, the narrators, and talking about them. One of the famous ones, which includes all of the men of Al-Bukhari and other books as well, from Al-Kutub al-Sitta, Muslim, Abu Dawud, Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah. One of the famous ones is Tahdhib al-Kamal. Tahdhib al-Kamal, huge book, maybe this big. Tahdhib al-Kamal, full of the biographies of the narrators. And that's why if anybody wants, as we go along with the explanation from next time now, when we go through the hadith and we look at the chains of narration of every hadith, if you want to check, because we can't do it every lesson, otherwise it would take too long, but if you want to do that yourselves as well, go to Taqreeb al-Tahdhib, the book known as Taqreeb al-Tahdhib. That is the one that gives, it's a dictionary. It's a one-volume dictionary. You go to the name of the narrator, authentic, reliable, thiqa, this, that, simple one-line ruling. That is summarized from Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, which is summarized from Taqreeb al-Tahdhib, Tahdhib al-Kamal, which is summarized from Al-Kamal. The original book known as Al-Kamal likely would be from here to about the end of the room. It was never printed. Tahdhib al-Kamal is about this big, 30 volumes or so. Then Tahdhib al-Tahdhib, you can get it down to 4 volumes. Then Taqreeb al-Tahdhib, the 1 volume, which is just the encyclopedia, gives you the ruling, one line on that narrator. If you go to Tahdhib, you'll get like a page, 2 pages, 10 pages on a narrator. So Taqreeb al-Tahdhib, you can use that if you want to check some of the rulings. We'll try and do as many we can as well, but it won't be possible to do every chain, every hadith. That's what we'll stop on then, and inshallah from next lesson we begin with the first hadith. Insha'Allah ta'ala, the first hadith from the next lesson then. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.